The great hall of Ravensworth Castle was filled with servants when Lord Ranulph Fitzwalter took Alice by the hand and led her to the seat that, for 30 years, had belonged to Maud Fitzwalter. "From this day, Alice shall be lady of this house," he announced, his voice carrying to the farthest corner of the hall. "And you, Lady Maud, shall serve as housekeeper. Be grateful I leave you a roof, for you have nowhere else to go." The silence that followed had the weight of a grave slab. Maud, standing beside the table where she had kept the castle's accounts for 3 decades, did not lower her eyes nor raise her voice. She only unfastened, with steady fingers, the belt from which hung the ring of master keys she had carried since the first day of her marriage, and held it out to Lord Ranulph. "May these keys serve you as well as they served me, Ranulph," she said, in a voice that unsettled more than one of those present. "I hope you know all that they open." Lord Ranulph took the keys without fully grasping the weight of those words, satisfied to have solved, with a single public gesture, a problem he had put off for months. No one in the hall, not even Alice, noticed how Maud, before withdrawing with her back straight, cast one last look at the stone walls rising above their heads, as one bidding farewell to something she had helped build with her own hands. To know how this story ends, how a wife publicly scorned came to bring her husband's castle to financial ruin, you must know Maud from months before, when she still managed Ravensworth's accounts without knowing her own marriage was about to become the stage for the greatest public humiliation of her life. Before we continue with this story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We're always glad to know how far this story has traveled. To understand how we came to that hall, we must go back some months, to the day Lord Ranulph, tormented by a vanity he admitted to no one, began keeping company with a young woman named Alice. Ravensworth Castle stood upon a rocky promontory overlooking the whole valley, its stone walls so solid that neighboring lords openly envied them. Few now remembered that those walls, the garrison that defended them, and the credit the region's merchants extended so generously to Lord Ranulph, had been financed, 30 years before, by the dowry Maud Fitzwalter brought to the marriage. Maud had come to Ravensworth as Ranulph's bride, a young woman of 24, daughter of a family of lesser nobility whose true wealth lay not in vast lands but in gold accumulated through generations of prudent trade. Her father, before the wedding, had insisted on drawing up a marriage settlement that Ranulph signed without paying it much heed, eager as he was to gain access to the fortune that would finally finance the rebuilding of the ruined castle he had inherited. Never forget, daughter, that a document signed in haste by a man in love with the gold it brings is worth more than any promise whispered in the ear, her father had told her, on her wedding day. Guard your copy well, and may God grant you the wisdom to know when to use it. Maud had kept those words with the same discipline with which she kept the castle's accounts, never imagining that 30 years later she would need them with an urgency her father could never have foreseen. Over the years, Ranulph had come to forget, or perhaps to convince himself he had forgotten, the exact origin of the wealth that sustained Ravensworth. He hunted, feasted, received other lords with a generosity that impressed the whole shire, while Maud quietly managed every coin that entered and left the castle, settled the tenants' disputes, and kept cordial relations with merchants whose credit, though Ranulph never fully knew it, depended largely on the reputation for solvency Maud's own dowry had established 3 decades before. "I am no longer young, Maud," Ranulph had confessed to her one night, staring into the fire with an expression she had not seen on him in years. "And when other lords look at me, I see in their eyes the same silent question, what does this man have left, save a castle his own wife manages better than he does? You have 30 years of peace in this valley left to you, Ranulph," she had answered, taking his hand. "That is no small thing." But he had not truly heard her that night, and that silent wound, fed by the fear of growing old having proven nothing by himself, would go looking for comfort in the face of a much younger woman. Alice had come to Ravensworth's court the previous winter, daughter of a modest family who saw in Lord Ranulph's attention a chance at advancement she herself had not asked for, but felt in no position to refuse either. She was 23, and though her easy laughter filled the castle's halls in a way Maud, always occupied with the accounts, had not replicated in years, Alice herself often felt uneasy under the attention of a man who held power over her family's commercial future. "She is not a wicked woman, mother," their eldest son, Philip, had told her once, seeing his mother's silent suffering. "I think she too is trapped in this, in her own way." "I know, my son," Maud had answered. "But that does not make it hurt any less." Philip, 28, and Ravensworth's natural heir, watched with growing indignation as his father let himself be dragged along by a fear he did not fully understand, torn between loyalty to his mother and the respect owed his father, a divided loyalty that would become, in the months that followed, one of the heaviest burdens of his adult life. The day Ranulph decided to publicly install Alice as Lady of the Castle came without warning, at a gathering officially called to celebrate the harvest, but which Ranulph turned, with a cruelty that surprised even his own counselors, into the scene of Maud's shaming. She, who had organized enough celebrations at Ravensworth to know exactly what such a day required in preparation, did not suspect until the very last moment that her own husband planned to use that gathering to strip her, before the whole household and several invited neighboring lords, of her place as lady of the house. Only minutes before the gathering, one of her most loyal maidservants whispered that she had heard Ranulph rehearsing the exact words with which he would announce the change. Maud felt the ground shift beneath her, but said nothing. She only dressed with her usual care, determined to face whatever came with the dignity she had upheld for 30 years. What followed was exactly what we already know, the public handing over of the keys, the calculated shame, Maud's serene silence as she withdrew from the hall without a single tear, without a word of protest, carrying with her only the quiet certainty that her husband had just made a mistake he himself would not understand until much later. If you have ever been replaced, if you have ever been made to feel that 30 years of devotion counted for nothing beside another's fear of growing old, then you already know something of the silence with which Maud carried, that night, the greatest humiliation of her married life. But stay with this story a little longer, because the justice that seems impossible is sometimes written on a parchment kept 30 years in a convent's chest, waiting only for someone with the serenity to seek it out at the right moment. Maud did not cry out nor beg that night. She simply packed her belongings with the same discipline she had brought to the castle's accounts, and the next morning, bidding farewell to no one but Philip, set off for the convent of St. Fritswide, where she had spent part of her youth before marriage. The prioress of the convent, Mother Editha, no relation to the family of that name in another shire, had been a close friend of Maud's own mother, and received her with open arms, needing no lengthy explanation of what had happened. "I knew this day might come, Maud," she said, helping her settle into a modest but dignified cell. "Your father, God rest him, always distrusted the memory of men in love with another's dowry. I need to find the marriage settlement, Mother. My father insisted a copy be kept in the convent chest, should I ever need it." The prioress, with the same calm born of 5 decades devoted to convent life, nodded and led Maud to the small archive where documents from dozens of shire families were kept, some over a century old. "Finding it will take time, my child, but we shall find something else too, the exact clause your father insisted on including, one that very few marriages in this shire carry written with such clarity." While Maud searched the convent archive, at Ravensworth Lord Ranulph, emboldened by his wife's lack of resistance, began making ever more reckless financial decisions, certain his position as lord of the castle was as solid as it had always been. He ordered the stables enlarged, commissioned new tapestries to impress neighboring lords, and sought new credit from the shire's merchants without realizing the trust they extended him depended largely on a reputation for solvency built upon Maud's original fortune. "And if the merchants ask after Lady Maud," his steward once asked, cautiously. "She always saw to those dealings herself." "Let them ask what they like," Ranulph had answered, with a confidence that admitted no doubt. "Ravensworth is mine, and mine it shall remain, with or without her." Philip, present at many of these conversations, watched with growing alarm as his father spent with a carelessness he had never shown while his mother managed the castle's finances, and began, in secret, visiting Maud at the convent to keep her informed of every reckless decision his father made. It was during one such visit that Maud, having now located the marriage settlement and holding it in her hands, decided to write to her brother, Sir Hugh de Vere, commander of the Knights Hospitaller, whose order's alliance with Ravensworth had for years protected the valley's borders against enemy raids. "Brother," she wrote, with the same serenity she brought to every decision of her life, "I do not write to ask for your revenge, but to inform you that my position at Ravensworth has changed in a way that touches directly upon our family's honor. You will know what to do with this information, as you always have." Hugh, receiving the letter, felt a fury he rarely allowed himself to show in public, but channeled, with the same military discipline that governed his whole life, into a cold and calculated decision. He would begin quietly preparing to withdraw the military alliance his order maintained with Ravensworth, announcing nothing until his sister told him the exact moment. Rumors that Maud was searching for old documents at St. Fritswide's convent reached Lord Ranulph's ears through an indiscreet merchant who, without ill intent, mentioned in passing that Ravensworth's former lady had spent several afternoons in the convent archive. Ranulph, whose confidence had begun to crack at the first signs that merchants hesitated to extend new credit, felt an alarm he had not felt in months. "What can that woman be seeking?" he asked his steward, an unease he could no longer fully disguise. "I do not know for certain, my lord. But I hear she has also written to her brother, the commander." That news was enough for Ranulph, seized by a panic he barely understood, to decide to act directly. He summoned Sir Hugh to a meeting, under the pretext of discussing border matters, but with the real intent of sounding out what he knew and meant to do. "Commander, I hear your sister has been writing you frequently. I trust she is not stirring up resentments that might harm the old alliance between our houses." Hugh, with the impassive face he had perfected across decades of military discipline, answered without revealing any of his true intentions. "My sister writes me what any sister writes her brother, Lord Ranulph. Family matters that concern no military alliance of this shire." But the answer, calculatedly ambiguous, left Ranulph with an unease he could not shake in the days that followed. At the convent, Maud and Mother Editha had completed their search for the marriage settlement, finding exactly what Maud's father had insisted on including 30 years before, an express clause providing for the full restitution of the dowry should the wife ever be repudiated or publicly shamed without just cause. "Here it is, Maud," said Mother Editha, pointing to the parchment with fingers trembling with age but steady in purpose. "Your father was more foresight than any of us imagined." Maud read the clause several times, feeling a new calm settle over her, different from the patient resignation she had carried these last months. "I must lay this before the bishop, Mother. I do not seek revenge, but neither will I allow 30 years of my life to be erased as though they never existed. The bishop will hear you, my child. But you must prepare yourself. Lord Ranulph will not accept this without a fight, and the fight may be long and painful before justice finally prevails." It was Philip who, alerted by a loyal servant, told his mother that Ranulph had begun to suspect her movements and might attempt something desperate to keep the marriage settlement from reaching the bishop. "Mother, I fear my father may attempt something rash if he learns you have the settlement," he told her, the night he arrived at the convent with this warning. "The merchants have already begun denying him new credit, and his desperation grows each day." "Then there is no time to lose, my son," Maud answered, with her usual serenity. "Tomorrow I shall request an audience with the bishop. I have already waited 30 years to claim what is mine. I shall not wait a single day longer than necessary." The bishop of the diocese, a man of 70 with a reputation for impartiality forged across decades of settling disputes among the region's most powerful families, received Maud in private audience scarcely 2 days after her request, struck by the gravity with which Ravensworth's former lady presented her case. "Lady Maud, these papers, if genuine, represent a most grave claim against Lord Ranulph Fitzwalter," said the bishop, examining the parchment closely. "Are you prepared for what this entails?" "I am, your grace." I do not seek my husband's ruin, but the acknowledgement of a truth he himself signed 30 years ago and chose to forget." The bishop, convinced by the document's authenticity and by Mother Editha's testimony, convened a formal ecclesiastical court, summoning Lord Ranulph to answer the claim for restitution of the marriage portion. Ranulph, receiving the summons, felt the world he had built over 30 years begin to crumble beneath him. Merchants, alerted by rumors of the dispute, had all but suspended the credit they once extended him so generously. Ravensworth's garrison, though he did not yet know it, no longer counted on the promise of reinforcements Sir Hugh's alliance had represented for years. He appeared before the court with an arrogance that barely masked his mounting panic, determined to deny any validity to the marriage settlement. Those papers, if they exist at all, were signed 30 years ago, under circumstances that no longer bear any relevance, he argued before the bishop. Ravensworth is mine by right of lordship, not by any woman's dowry. Lord Ranulph, the bishop answered, with the calm authority of one who had presided over hundreds of similar disputes, a document freely signed does not lose its force with the passage of time, quite the contrary. It gains the strength of what has been honored by both parties for decades, until the day one of them chooses to ignore it for convenience. Mother Editha, called to testify to the document's authenticity, confirmed before the court that the settlement had remained untouched in the convent archive since the day of the wedding, altered by no one. The decisive moment came when Sir Hugh, present at the hearing by the bishop's express request, rose to confirm what Ranulph still did not know for certain. "Your Grace, the order I serve maintains Ravensworth's military protection solely through the kinship my sister represents with this house," he declared, in the firm voice of a man accustomed to command. "Should the restitution she claims not be honored with justice, my order shall formally withdraw that protection before the season is out." Ranulph's face, sustained until then by an ever more fragile arrogance, went entirely pale. He understood, in that instant, that he faced not only the loss of a fortune, but the loss of his very castle's security. "This cannot be true," he murmured, seeking in vain some support among those present. 30 years, and no one warned me." "No one had cause to warn you, Lord Ranulph," the bishop answered, with a severity that left no room for doubt. "You yourself signed the terms of your own protection 30 years ago. That you forgot them does not make them void." The court ordered full restitution of Maud's marriage portion, with a strict deadline that, combined with the withdrawal of the military alliance and the collapse of merchant credit, plunged Ravensworth into a financial crisis from which Lord Ranulph never fully recovered. If you have ever been replaced, if 30 years of your life have ever been treated as though they counted for nothing beside another's fear of growing old, then this story is, in part, yours too. Maud did not find justice by shouting at the one who shamed her. She found it by holding, with unshakable serenity, the truth written in a document she herself had guarded with patience for 30 years. May this story remind you that dignity never depends on what others choose to give you, but on the quiet firmness with which you hold what is rightfully yours. And that justice, however long delayed, always finds its way back to the one who never stopped deserving it. With the restitution of her marriage portion secured, Maud purchased a modest but dignified property at the edge of the valley, where she began a new life managing her own lands with the same discipline she had applied for 30 years to Ravensworth's accounts. "I do not seek your father's complete ruin, Philip," she told her son, when he asked whether she would ever consider any reconciliation. "But neither shall I pretend the last few months did not happen. Each person must bear the consequences of their own decisions." Alice, freed from the impossible position Ranulph had placed her in, and seeing how Ravensworth's financial ruin erased any advantage her own family had hoped to gain, returned to her native lands with a bitter understanding of how little her own well-being had mattered to Ranulph. Sir Hugh, his promise to withdraw the military alliance fulfilled, continued serving his order for many years more, though with a transformed reputation among the Shire's lords. From a discreet, reserved commander, he became known as the man who had upheld, without hesitation, his own sister's honor before the one who had shamed her. "I did no more than what justice and my family's honor demanded," he always said, when asked about what had happened at Ravensworth. Any brother worthy of the name would have done the same. Lord Ranulph, unable to sustain the castle financially without merchant credit or the Order's military protection, was forced, in the years that followed, to gradually sell off much of the land surrounding Ravensworth, reducing his former grandeur to a shadow of what it had been. Philip, Ravensworth's lawful heir, took over the administration of what remained with a prudence learned from watching his mother, and managed, in time, to stabilize what little his father had not squandered, though he never recovered the prosperity Ravensworth had known under Maud's quiet stewardship. Few in the Shire ever knew what it cost the bishop to make the decision he made that day in the ecclesiastical court. He was not, as some imagined, a man who took pleasure in shaming a powerful lord before his own shire. He had presided over dozens of similar disputes across decades, and in all that time had rarely had to order a restitution as severe as the one imposed upon Lord Ranulph. That same night, before Maud departed back for the convent, the bishop asked to speak with her privately. "Lady Maud," he said, with a gravity that contrasted with the solemnity of that afternoon's court, "I would have you know I did not take this decision lightly. A bishop who favors one party without irrefutable proof loses all moral authority for the rest of his days. Had the settlement carried the smallest doubt of authenticity, I myself would have had to set it aside." "I understand, Your Grace," Maud answered. "And I thank you for hearing me with as open a mind as a heart. There is something more I must tell you," the bishop continued, an expression crossing his face that for the first time all day seemed genuinely his own. "My own mother was widowed young, and spent years defending the little land that remained to her from kin who sought to seize it, claiming a woman alone could not manage it. I watched what it cost her to hold her ground. I recognized in you that same quiet firmness, and that, more than any document, was what convinced me to weigh your case with the care it deserved." Maud, moved by a confession she had not expected from a man of his standing, could only nod in silence, feeling that night, for the first time in months, the weight upon her shoulders eased more than any official ruling alone had managed. Many years later, when Maud was an old woman with hair gone entirely white but a back still straight, one of her granddaughters asked her, as so many times before, to tell the story of the handing over of the keys. "Tell it again, grandmother, the part where you gave the keys without saying a single word more than needed." "I have told it to you 20 times already, little one, and will likely tell it 20 more," Maud would always answer, with a smile that no longer carried any pain. "But very well, once more. Sit beside me." And she would tell it, with the same precise details every time, how she had handed over the keys without a tear, how Mother Editha had helped her find the settlement her own father had kept with such foresight, how Sir Hugh had kept his word before the whole court. "And were you not afraid of grandfather, grandmother? When he sent you to serve as a housekeeper?" "I was afraid, yes, very afraid," Maud would answer, always with the same disarming honesty. "But I learned, that very night, that fear and dignity can live within the same person. One need not stop being afraid to act with firmness. One need only never let fear decide in your place." The new lands Maud managed in her last years prospered under the same discipline she had always applied, and became, over time, a model of prudent management other lords of the Shire began to imitate, sending their own stewards to learn the methods Maud had perfected across the decades. 15 years after the court sentence, when Lord Ranulph now lived on a small property that was scarcely a shadow of what Ravensworth had been, a wandering friar collecting alms across the Shire stopped to spend the night in his modest house, not knowing who the old man was who offered him table and shelter. Over supper, the friar mentioned without malice that he came from a valley where they told the story of a scorned wife who had recovered, through an old document, the justice her husband had denied her. Ranulph listened in silence, without revealing his identity, until the friar finished the tale. "And what became of the husband, brother?" he asked at last. "What happened to him after he lost everything?" They say he learned, late, the true worth of what he had scorned, the friar answered, not suspecting he spoke to the man himself. Though I, if I may say so, believe we all deserve the chance to acknowledge our mistakes before we die. Ranulph did not sleep that night. He sat by the fire, thinking of the 30 years Maud had quietly sustained his castle, of the fear that had led him to scorn what he never knew how to value, and of the lesson he had finally learned, too late to undo the harm, but not too late to acknowledge it. Maud, receiving years later the friar's message through a traveler who had walked the same road, listened in silence, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, with the same serenity that had carried her through the whole story, she answered, "Tell him, if ever you see him again, that I too learned something from all this, that justice does not seek to destroy the one who errs, but to restore to each what is rightfully theirs." Ranulph died 2 winters later, on that same modest property, alone but, as the priest who attended him would later recount, with a face strangely at peace for a man who had lost so much. The ring of master keys Maud had handed over that day in Ravensworth's great hall, symbol of the public shame she had suffered, became over the years an object of meaning opposite to what Ranulph had intended. In the Shire's memory, it ceased to represent Maud's submission and became instead a symbol of the dignity with which she had known how to hand over, without a word more than needed, what she already knew she would recover by right. A Shire chronicler, gathering decades later the most notable stories of the region, included a detailed account of what happened at Ravensworth, citing words attributed to the bishop himself shortly before his death, that justice does not always arrive by sword or by army, but sometimes with a parchment kept patiently for 30 years in the chest of a forgotten convent. Maud died at 81, on the property she had managed with dignity through the last decades of her life, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words, as those present would later recount, were a simple instruction given to her eldest granddaughter. "Care for what is yours, child. And when the time comes to hand it over, if ever it does, do so with the same serenity with which I handed over Ravensworth's keys, knowing, deep in your heart, that truth always finds its way back to the one who never stopped deserving it." Among the Shire families who felt closely the consequences of Ravensworth's financial crisis, none had so close a bond with Maud herself as that of Wat, the smith who for years had forged horseshoes and weapons for the castle garrison, and who found himself, after the restitution of the dowry, without the chief customer sustaining his forge. Maud, learning from Philip of Wat's difficult situation, did not hesitate to employ him for her new property, offering him a fair arrangement that let him rebuild his trade far from Ravensworth's shadow. "You need not do this, Lady Maud," Wat had told her, surprised by the generosity of one who, technically, had helped bring about the financial ruin that also affected him. "My forge depended on the castle you yourself helped bring down. Your forge depended on a lord who stopped honoring his own promises." "What, not on me," Maud had answered. "And I see no reason an honest man should pay the price of another's reckless decisions." That gesture, repeated with other craftsmen's families indirectly affected by Ravensworth's fall, cemented Maud's reputation in the Shire as an administrator who understood justice not only as the claiming of her own rights, but as a responsibility toward those who, through no fault of their own, depended on the consequences of others' decisions. Over the years, Wat's son became one of the trusted stewards of Maud's properties, and passed on to his own children the story of how his family had survived the crisis thanks to the generosity of a woman who, having every right to think only of herself after 30 years of silent humiliation, chose instead to think also of those who, like his own father, bore no blame on the conflict that had affected her. Mother Editha, whose wisdom had proved decisive in locating the marriage settlement that returned to Maud her dignity and fortune, spent her last years devoted to a task she considered as important as any other convent work, carefully cataloging and organizing the convent archive, ensuring no important document would ever again be lost among unsorted parchments for decades. She personally trained a young novice, Sister Cecily, passing on to her not only the technical knowledge of cataloging but also the most important lesson she had learned beside Maud years before. A convent archive is not merely a storehouse of old papers, Cecily, she often repeated, through long afternoons of instruction in the convent's small scriptorium. It is the memory of the justice someone, someday, may need to claim. Care for every document as though you knew that, one day, it will be the only proof upholding someone's dignity. Mother Editha died in the convent itself, surrounded by the documents that had been her companions for decades, several years after the judgment that had changed Maud's fate. Her last words, as Sister Cecily would later recount, present in her final hours, concerned Maud herself and the papers that had restored her dignity. "Tell Lady Maud that I did well to keep that chest with such care all these years. That no document is worth less simply because no one consults it for decades, Cecily. Remember it always." Maud, on learning of Mother Editha's death, insisted on personally funding a side chapel in the prioress's memory within the convent itself. With an inscription she dictated herself, "Here is remembered a woman who understood that justice sometimes waits patiently for decades at the bottom of a forgotten chest, until someone has the wisdom to seek it out." Years after the judgment, when the story of Ravensworth's restitution already circulated, transformed and embellished, across distant shires, a woman of middle years arrived one afternoon at Maud's new property, asking after the Lady of the Keys, as she was now called in some neighboring regions. Her name was Gajafu, and she came from a distant shire where her own family faced a dispute much like the one Maud had lived through years before, a husband who, blinded by fear of growing old without glory, threatened to disown rights she had silently upheld through decades of marriage. "I have heard your story told by 3 different minstrels, Lady Maud, each with different details," Gajafu said, sitting before her in the hall of the new house. "But in every version something repeats, that you did not shout, did not seek revenge, waited for the right moment and held fast to what was yours by right." "That is more or less how it happened," Maud answered, with a tired but sincere smile. "Though minstrels always add some detail I myself do not recall living." Gajafu told her then of her own situation, and Maud listened with the same patience she had learned during the years when no one listened to her. "I cannot tell you what to do, Gajafu," she said at the end of that long conversation. "Each woman must find her own truth and her own moment to bring it to light. But I can tell you this, keep every document, every letter, every parchment that might seem worthless today. One never knows which forgotten piece will one day return to you all that the world tried to take away." Gajafu left Maud's property with a new resolve, and months later, a messenger arrived with news from her distant shire. An old family document, found at last in her own church's archive, had confirmed her right to the lands her husband had tried to seize. The tale, carried mouth to mouth among the pilgrims who walked the region's roads, always ended with the same words Gajafu repeated to whoever would listen, that she had learned from a woman named Maud that justice, however well hidden, always finds someone to unearth it. What few in the shire expected was that, as generations passed, Lord Ranulph's own nephew, raised far from Ravensworth after his uncle's ruin, would come to be one of the most fervent defenders of the legacy of justice Maud had left behind. His name was Alwyn, and he grew up hearing from his own father, Ranulph's younger brother, the whole story of that judgment, told not as a family shame to hide, but as a lesson Ranulph himself had asked, in his last years, be passed on without embellishment or excuse. "My father told me this story differently than the minstrels tell it," Alwyn would often say to young men who came asking him about the customs of managing marital property. "He did not tell it as my uncle's defeat, but as the day he finally understood what he had done, without knowing it, for 30 years, mistaking the fear of growing old for the right to scorn what sustained his own life." Alwyn, faithful to that inherited lesson, devoted much of his life to promoting, among the shire's lords, the custom of clearly documenting marriage settlements, ensuring no other man could claim, as his uncle had tried, ignorance of obligations he himself had freely signed. It was Alwyn himself who, years later, insisted a small marital archive be established in the shire where families could deposit copies of their own settlements, so no future wife would have to wait 30 years, as Maud had, before her own dignity was acknowledged. "Let it all be written, and kept in a safe place, without exception," he insisted before the shire's lords, whenever the need to formalize such agreements was debated. "My own uncle scorned what he had signed because he believed time would erase his own word. Let us not allow that to happen again in this shire. As the years passed, and with Maud's new property now a model of prudent management respected across the shire, her descendants decided to build a small chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Providence, in gratitude for the justice Maud had received after years of patient silence. The idea came, in truth, from what the Smiths' own children, grateful for life for the generosity Maud had shown them after Ravensworth's crisis, who wished to leave a lasting testament of gratitude that would outlive the direct memory of those who had lived the events themselves. "It is not only for devotion, Lady Maud," Watson explained, when he came to ask her leave to build the chapel. "It is so that, 100 years from now, when no one remembers your name, those who pass here will know that here there was justice, and that faith and human dignity always walked together in this family." Maud, moved to tears for the first time in a long while, gave her leave without hesitation, and helped choose the exact spot where the small building would stand, near the garden where she liked to sit and watch her grandchildren play. The chapel was completed 2 years later, built of stone brought from a nearby quarry, with a small altar where, in time, a replica of the original ring of keys was placed, forged by Watt's own son in honor of the story that had changed the fate of both families. We bless today not only this chapel, but the memory of the justice God allowed to flourish in this family through the patience of a worthy woman, the priest said, at the dedication ceremony, before the whole gathered community. May this chapel remind every visitor that no true right remains forgotten forever. The same bishop who had presided over that decisive court, by then retired from his duties after decades of service to the diocese, devoted his last years to writing a small treatise on cases of marriage portion restitution he had observed across his long career, including a whole chapter devoted, without naming her directly out of respect for her privacy, to the case of the Lady of the Keys of Ravensworth. "I have presided over dozens of marital disputes in my life," he wrote in that treatise, which would later circulate among bishops across the region for generations, "but none taught me so much as that court. I learned that the firmest justice is not that which is imposed by authority, but that which rests upon documents no one can question, brought forward by those who had the patience to wait for the exact moment to reveal them." Sister Cecily, Mother Editha's successor as the convent's archivist, kept for her whole life the custom her teacher had taught her, carefully cataloging every old document in the convent archive, not waiting for a dispute to arise to do so, but as regular practice ensuring no right would ever again be lost through neglect. Despite all the changes brought by passing centuries, there was something in that shire that never wholly changed, the story of the lady who handed over the keys without a tear, and recovered them, months later, through the quiet force of a document kept for 30 years, continued to be told beside every winter fire. The shire's children, generation after generation, grew up hearing that story without always knowing every exact detail, until some grandparent told them the whole tale, how a wife publicly shamed had come to bring financial ruin upon the castle she herself had financed, without ever raising her voice. "And is it true she did not say a single word when they took her place away?" the youngest always asked, eyes wide before the fire. As true as that this very chapel's keys carry the same design as the one she handed over that day, whoever told the story always answered. And more important still, as true as this, that since then, in this shire, no one forgets that dignity needs no shouting to make itself known. Sir Hugh de Vere, by then elderly and retired from his military duties after decades of service to his order, spent his last years writing a letter he never sent, addressed to his own sister, in which he reflected on what had happened at Ravensworth with an honesty he rarely allowed himself in his official correspondence. "Sister," he wrote, in a parchment that would be found after his death kept among his most treasured belongings, "for years I have wondered whether I did right in withdrawing our order's protection from Ravensworth, knowing that decision would condemn to ruin not only Ranulph, but innocents who depended on the castle for their livelihood. But every time I doubted, I remembered your serene face handing over those keys without a tear, and understood that the true cruelty had not been my decision, but the shame you endured for months before I even knew what was happening." The letter, found by his own nephews after his death, was finally delivered to Maud, elderly herself by then, who read it with silent tears before keeping it beside the marriage settlement that had changed her fate. The original ring of master keys Maud had handed over that day of shame, together with the marriage settlement that had restored her dignity, ended up kept together in a carved wooden chest inside the chapel her descendants had built in her honor, transformed now not into objects of daily use, but into family relics shown with reverence to every new generation. "May I touch them, grandmother?" some child of the family would always ask, referring to both the keys and the papers, with the same reverent respect with which one touches something sacred. "Gently, child," whoever held the chest's key would always answer. These keys were handed over with dignity, and these papers restored that very dignity months later. They deserved to be treated with the same care with which Lady Maud upheld them her whole life. Travelers who, centuries later, stopped out of curiosity on lands that had belonged to Maud and asked why a simple ring of keys and some old papers deserved such care, always received the same brief answer, that the ring of keys had once been handed over in shame, and recovered later through justice. In the last months of her long life, when her strength barely sufficed to sit each morning in the garden beside the chapel, Maud received a visit from a young maiden of the Shire, promised in marriage to a man whose family was known for its vanity and its scorn toward women it considered no longer useful to its purposes. "I have heard it said, Lady Maud, that you know what it is to be publicly scorned and still uphold yourself with dignity," the young woman said, sitting beside her on the same bench where Maud now spent most of her days. "I am soon to marry into a family that treats women as you once were treated, and I do not know if I shall have the courage you had." Maud looked at her a long while, and answered with words the young woman would remember for the rest of her life. "Courage, child, is not the absence of fear, nor the certainty of winning. It is the decision, renewed each day, not to let the world decide your worth only because someone else, at some moment, chose to scorn you. I ask only that you keep, with care, every document that might seem worthless today, for you never know which of them will one day be the key to your own justice." The young woman left with those words carved into her heart, and years later, when her husband's family tried to deny her a share of inheritance rightfully hers, she found in the memory of that conversation the strength to hold firm until justice, however delayed, was finally acknowledged, exactly as it had happened to Maud so many years before. Maud lived to see her own grandchildren grow up on the property she had managed with dignity after the judgment that restored her fortune. In her last years, by then too old to attend to every detail of management herself, she spent her afternoons seated in the garden, watching her great-grandchildren play near the small chapel she had raised in Mother Editha's memory. It was in one of those last years that, feeling her strength fail, she called her eldest granddaughter and the trusted steward she had trained over the years, to leave them one last instruction, clear and precise as everything she had done in life. "When I am gone, I want these lands always managed with the same prudence with which I managed Ravensworth for 30 years, she said, her voice weakened but firm. "And I want no important document of this family ever again forgotten in an uncatalogued chest, so that none of my descendants ever have to wait 30 years for justice to be acknowledged." Her granddaughter, holding back tears, promised to keep every word, and did so for the rest of her own life, passing the same instruction to her own children and grandchildren, so that the memory of that public shaming transformed into justice, far from fading with the passing centuries, became the quiet foundation upon which the whole family came to build its own identity. Maud died at 81, as has been told, surrounded by her family, with the same serenity that had defined her at every moment of her life. Her funeral drew nobles from across the Shire, many of whom had barely known her in life but had grown up hearing, in one form or another, some version of her story, told beside the fire on long winter nights long before most of them were even born. The Shire's chroniclers, gathering generations later the most notable stories of the region, always agreed upon the same close for the tale of Ravensworth's keys, taken almost word for word from what Maud repeated to whoever would listen, that human dignity never depends on what others decide to give you, but on the quiet firmness with which you uphold what is rightfully yours, even when the whole world seems to have forgotten you. What few in the Shire expected was that, over the years, Alice herself, by then settled into a modest marriage far from Ravensworth, would come to send her eldest daughter to serve as an apprentice in the administration of Maud's properties, a gesture of belated gratitude that surprised more than one. My mother never forgot the words Lady Maud spoke to her that afternoon by the stables at Ravensworth. Alice's daughter, by then grown, would tell whoever would listen. She said it was the only time, in this whole story, that she was treated as a human being trapped in an impossible situation, and not as a villain. Maud, welcoming the young woman into her home, showed not the slightest resentment toward the name she carried. Your mother and I were, each in our own way, pieces in the fear of a man who dreaded growing old, having proven nothing by himself, she explained, when the young woman asked, uncertain, whether her presence caused discomfort. I hold no grudge against her, and even less against you, who bore no part in what happened. The young woman, trained for years under Maud's tutelage, became in time a steward respected in her own right, and passed on to her own children the lesson she had learned from the woman who, by every right, might have been her enemy. Centuries after Maud's death, when no one in the Shire remembered with exactness the faces of Ranulph, Alice, or Sir Hugh himself, the name of Maud Fitzwalter still appeared, year after year, in the registers of the small chapel her descendants had raised, invoked each time a new generation swore, before the chest holding the family relics, to continue managing their own lands with the same prudence and dignity she had shown throughout her life. The Shire's historians, studying the ecclesiastical archives generations later, would find in Maud's case one of the most cited examples of how patience, faith, and careful documentation could, together, return to a person not only her fortune, but the totality of her lost dignity. And each of them, finishing their writing on the case, could not help adding the same final reflection, almost as though Maud herself whispered the words from across the centuries, that no public shaming, however deep it may seem in the moment, can ever erase what rightfully belongs to one who has the patience to wait for the right moment to claim it. And when, many years later, Alwyn's own descendants asked why so great a shire kept, with such care, the story of a single woman who handed over some keys without protest, the answer they received was always the same, passed down word for word from those who had the privilege of knowing Maud in person, that some stories deserve to be kept not because the events they tell are extraordinary, but because they teach, better than any sermon, that the quiet patience of a single person, upheld to the very end, can truly change the fate of an entire family, of an entire castle, and of every generation still to come. There was, among all the moments of her long life, one particular afternoon Maud would remember more clearly than any other, even in her last years, when the memory of lesser details began to blur, the afternoon when, seated in the very garden where she would spend her last days, she watched her great-grandchildren play near the chapel while the sun set over the land she had come to love as much as she once loved Ravensworth. "What are you thinking of, grandmother?" one of her great-granddaughters asked her, sitting beside her on the stone bench. "I am thinking how strange life's path is, my child," Maud answered, with a serene smile. "Many years ago, on an afternoon very different from this one, I handed over some keys believing I lost everything I had built. And yet look now, I have more than I ever imagined having, not in gold nor in land, but in the quiet certainty of having upheld my own dignity to the end." It was that same afternoon, as those present would later recount, that Maud spoke one of the last reflections her descendants would pass down most faithfully across the centuries, that life, like the keys of a castle, sometimes demands we hand them over with dignity, trusting that justice will, sooner or later, restore to us what truly belongs to us. Ravensworth, the castle Maud had financed with her own dowry 30 years before and that Ranulph had lost through his own vanity, ended up passing, after his death, into Philip's hands, who administered it for the rest of his life with the same prudence he had learned watching his mother since childhood. "This castle exists because of her, not because of my father," Philip always told his own children, showing them the hall where his mother had handed over the keys with such dignity. "Let it never be forgotten in this family that the walls protecting us were paid for by the patience of a woman almost no one listened to in time." Philip had a small tapestry hung, in the very hall where his mother's public shaming had taken place, depicting the scene of the handing over of the keys, not as a memory of shame but as a permanent warning for any future Lord of Ravensworth, that no man should ever forget to whom he truly owed the fortune he administered. Of the original documents that had changed Maud's fate, little changed physically as later centuries turned them into venerated relics, kept not in daily use but in the same carved wooden chest inside the family chapel. The marriage settlement's parchment, now yellowed but perfectly legible, and the ring of master keys, its metal still gleaming beneath candlelight whenever the chest was opened for some special visitor, became the objects the family's children always asked to see. "May I look at them closely, grandmother?" some child would always ask, with the same reverent respect with which one observes something sacred. "Gently, child," whoever held the chest's key at the time would always answer. These objects returned to our great-grandmother not only her home, but her own dignity. They deserved to be treated with the same care with which she upheld them her whole life. Travelers who, centuries later, stopped out of curiosity on the lands that had belonged to Maud and asked why a simple ring of keys and some old parchments deserved such care, always received the same brief answer from whoever kept the chest at that time: that ring of keys had once been handed over in shame, and recovered later through justice, and that those parchments had slept 30 years in a convent chest before someone had the wisdom to seek them out at the precise moment. Whoever visits today the small chapel raised in Maud Fitzwalter's honor, and asks to see with respect the chest where her relics are kept, will still find, carved in simple letters upon the stone of the threshold, the last line she asked to be written before she died, the very one that sums up, better than any chronicle, the whole meaning of her story: that dignity, like justice, never belongs to whoever chooses to take it away first, but to whoever has the patience to uphold it until the day it is finally restored in full. Whoever today walks the lands that once belonged to Maud Fitzwalter, and stops before the small chapel her descendants raised in her honor, will still find, on days of clear sunlight, the same kind of golden light that lit that last afternoon in the garden, as though the landscape itself had decided to preserve, generation after generation, something of the peace she came to find after so much shame borne with dignity. The chapel's keepers, sextons, and stewards who have followed one another across the centuries, keep alive the custom of telling, to whoever stops to ask, the most faithful version of the story possible, without the minstrel's embellishments, without the chronicler's exaggerations, only the essential core that Maud herself would have recognized as true: that dignity is never measured by what others choose to give you or take from you, but by the quiet firmness with which you uphold, against every shame, the calm certainty of your own worth, until the day the whole world, sooner or later, is compelled to acknowledge it. And so, whenever a visitor asks why so old a story continues to be told with such care upon those lands, the answer they receive, spoken by whoever keeps the chapel at that time, always circles back to that same silent instant in which a woman, without shedding a single tear, handed over a set of keys before an entire shire, and discovered, months later, that this serene gesture had been, from the very beginning, the seed of all the justice that would follow. Before he died, Sir Hugh made one last long journey from his order's chapter house to the property where Maud spent her final years, wishing to see his sister once more. They sat together in the garden, as they had not done in decades, with the same quiet ease of their youth, and spoke at length of everything that had happened since that distant summer of the judgment. "I have never stopped asking myself whether I did right, sister," Hugh confessed, his hair by then entirely white. Withdrawing the order's protection meant condemning to ruin not only Ranulph, but innocents who depended on that castle. "And I have never stopped thanking you for doing it, brother," Maud answered, taking his hand with the same tenderness of their childhood. "For without your firmness, my dignity would have remained only a fine word written on a parchment, never truly acknowledged by anyone." Hugh, moved by those words, stayed with her several days before returning to his order, and that journey, as he would later tell his fellow knights, restored to him a peace he had not felt in years. It was during that same visit that Hugh, watching Philip manage the lands with the same wisdom learned from his mother, understood that the lesson of justice his family had learned in those difficult years would not end with his own generation, but would continue, from father to son, for a long time to come. "I see in your son the same firmness I saw in you that day at court, sister," he told Maud, the last evening before departing. "I believe Ravensworth, or what remains of it, is in good hands for the generations to come." Every year, in the region where Maud had built her new life, a spring fair drew merchants and visitors from across the realm, and it was at one such fair, many years after the judgment, that the story of Ravensworth's restitution reached a fame that spread well beyond the region's own borders. A cloth merchant, who had heard the story from a passing customer, decided to embroider onto a small tapestry the scene of the handing over of the keys, selling it afterward as a curiosity to nobles and merchants visiting the fair, each of whom carried away, back to their own homeland, both the object and the tale that accompanied it. I did not do it for profit, in truth, the merchant confessed, years later, when someone asked why he had spent so much time on that seemingly unprofitable tapestry. I did it because every time I told that story to a customer, I saw in their eyes the same quiet hope that justice, however late, might truly come for them too. Those tapestries, scattered now across several regions of the realm, carried Maud's story to places she herself never imagined reaching, and more than one family, looking at that embroidered scene, found the courage to search their own forgotten archives for proof of a right they believed lost forever. Philip, by then elderly himself and nearing the point of leaving the administration of what remained of Ravensworth to his own children, spent the last years of his life gathering and writing all the memories he had of his mother, not to publish them, but so that his descendants would have, beyond the legend already embellished by minstrels, the true and intimate memory of who Maud truly had been, far from the court and the parchments. My mother was not only the woman of the keys everyone tells of, he wrote, in the opening lines of that small family diary. She was also the woman who taught me to read accounts before I could even read letters, who laughed rarely but when she did lit up the whole hall, who never forgot the name of a single servant of the castle, however humble their task. That diary, kept with the same care given to the chest of relics, became over the years a precious source for descendants wishing to know not only Maud's public story, but also the woman behind that story, with her own weaknesses, her own affections, and her own everyday humanity that no legend could ever fully capture. Maud's last summer came with the same calm with which she had faced every season of her life, without drama or particular omens, only the slow approach of an end she herself seemed to welcome with the same serenity with which she had welcomed every other trial. She spent her days between the garden and the small chapel, receiving from time to time visits from some grandchild or old family friend, and continued, as long as her strength allowed, to review her own land's accounts personally, insisting that no habit of a lifetime should change simply because the years made themselves felt. I do not fear death, Philip, she confessed to her son, one of the last evenings before falling seriously ill. I have already faced, in life, the loss of everything I thought I had. I have learned that one can rebuild almost anything, with patience and with dignity. What I do not fear losing now is that very lesson, for I know I have passed it well to you and to your children. She died one morning at the end of August, her chamber window open toward the garden where she had spent so many peaceful afternoons, surrounded by her family, with the small chest of relics placed, by her express wish, on the table beside her bed. Her last words, as those present would later recount, were spoken to that very chest, almost in silent dialogue with the objects that had marked her whole life. You did your work well. Now rest too, as I shall rest. Maud's funeral gathered, as already told, nobles and common folk from across the shire, but it was one small detail, noticed only by a few among the most attentive present, that remained fixed in the memory of that day. When it came time to lay her body in the family crypt, Philip insisted that the ring of master keys not be placed in his mother's hands as a funeral relic, but returned instead to the chapel's chest, that it may keep serving the living, not rest with the dead, as he told those present. That decision, small as it seemed, perfectly reflected the spirit with which Maud had lived every single day of her existence after the judgment, never clinging to the past as a trophy, always focused on how her own story might continue to serve those who came after her. Sister Cecily, by then elderly prioress of the convent of St. Fritswide, personally officiated part of the funeral rite, reminding all present of the words her own teacher, Mother Editha, had spoken so many years before regarding Maud, that some people are born to receive justice, and others, rarer still, are born to teach an entire shire what it truly means to deserve it. In the months following the funeral, Philip and his own children devoted themselves to completing Maud's final wish, ensuring the small chapel and its archive of family documents remained forever open to anyone in the Shire needing to consult examples of well-drafted marriage settlements, transforming what had begun as a private family shrine into a resource serving the whole community. Let this chapel never be only a place of remembrance, but also a place of practical help to whoever needs it, Philip wrote in the Foundation's official register, words his descendants would honor for generations, keeping alive not only Maud's memory, but also her concrete work of quiet justice. With the passing of generations, the archive at Maud's chapel truly became a landmark for the whole Shire, visited not only by nobles seeking models for their own marriage settlements, but also by simple merchant and craftsman families who, inspired by the story of What the Smith, sought to understand how to legally protect their own commercial and marital agreements. A young clerk, trained by consulting that very archive, wrote years later a small practical manual on drafting clear and defensible marriage settlements, dedicating it explicitly to the memory of Lady Maud Fitzwalter, who taught an entire shire that a well-written document is worth more than 1,000 promises spoken aloud. That manual, simple but effective, spread well beyond the borders of the original shire, carrying Maud's name, though often forgotten by the wider public by then, to influence legal practices in territories she herself could never have imagined reaching in life. It was thanks to that very open archive that, decades after Maud's death, another woman of the shire, in a situation strikingly similar to the one she herself had lived, managed to quickly find the documentation needed to defend her own rights, without having to wait 30 years as the chapel's founder had. If it were not for this archive, for this story kept with such care, I would not have known even where to begin looking, that woman confessed, years later, when she in turn came to give thanks at the chapel. Lady Maud never knew me, and yet her patience of centuries ago saved my justice today. And so, century after century, the story of Maud Fitzwalter continued to travel well beyond the borders of the small shire where it all began, carried not by armies nor by solemn proclamations, but by the simple determination with which a family, then a convent, then an entire community, decided never to let the memory of a quiet dignity fade with the passing of time. Whoever today stops to read the inscription upon the threshold of the small chapel, and then turns to look at the hills where Ravensworth Castle once stood, now reduced to a few ivy-covered ruins, can still sense, if they pay close enough attention, the echo of that ancient lesson, that no shame, however public and cruel, truly has the power to erase what a person builds with patience, with faith, and with the firm, quiet certainty of their own worth. Perhaps, the Shire's elders always said, closing the tale beside the winter fire, that is exactly why so simple a story, a woman, a set of keys, a parchment kept for 30 years, deserve to be remembered across the centuries, because justice, when it finally finds the way to make itself known, needs no great armies nor grand halls to do so. It needs, often, only one faithful parchment, one patient heart, and the time required for the two to meet at last in the moment that was always meant to be theirs. And anyone who, even now, walks the path leading toward those distant ruins, short of breath and tired of leg just as Maud must have been that first morning she set out for the convent so many centuries ago, will find waiting beyond the last rise the same quiet silence that once wrapped those walls, faithful, unchanging, indifferent to passing time, yet still carrying within it every unshed tear, every carefully measured word, and every small victory a single woman, with a ring of keys in a heart that never stopped hoping, rested drop by drop from the unjust silence of men, until it became, with time and with faith, the calm river of justice that even now carries her name in a whisper among the stones of that distant shire. For anyone with ears willing to listen and a heart willing to believe that even the smallest inheritance, held with dignity, can be enough to change the course of everything, even when the whole world, in that first moment of public shame, seemed utterly certain of the harsh and bitter contrary, and she herself, handing over those keys with only her own heart to guide her, could not yet imagine how far her own patience would one day carry her, nor how many generations still to come would one day repeat her name beside that same winter fire, as living proof of what it truly means never to surrender, even when the only weapon one holds is the quiet patience to wait for the right day to make one's voice heard at last, before those who for far too long had chosen not to listen, and who would, in the end, have no choice left but to hear her fully, honestly, and without the smallest doubt remaining, exactly as it happened that summer day, before the whole silent hall of the bishop's own court, when the truth, at long last, was allowed to speak plainly and without fear, in the same steady voice that had always belonged to Maud Fitzwalter alone, widow in grief, mother in devotion, sister in loyalty, and, above all else, mistress and true. Lady of her own destiny, now and forevermore, remembered by every generation that followed as the woman who, without ever once raising her voice in anger, made an entire shire finally stop, listen, and learn, at last and for all time, what quiet dignity, held firm through 30 long years of silence, could truly accomplish when its moment finally, rightfully, and irrevocably came to pass before the eyes of an entire, watching shire that would never again forget her name, nor the lesson she left behind for every daughter, granddaughter, and generation still yet to come, for as long as this quiet, patient, and utterly truthful story continues, faithfully and gladly, to be told beside the fire, from one generation to the very next, forever and always.